On this C90 cassette, we're going to have a look at the TARRASCH variation of the French defense, which occurs after the moves E4, E6, D4, D5, knight D2. The main point behind this move, 3 knight D2, as opposed to the more natural development of the knight at C3, is that it avoids the possible pin, 3 bishop B4, and the consequent likely doubling of the C-pawns for white. The move was popularized over the last 10 years by Karpov, and he has achieved many tournament successes with it. On this side of the C90, we're going to have a look at some of the less regular replies to 3 knight D2. And on the second side, we're going to have a look at the two principal replies, which have crystallized over the last 10-20 years as 3 knight to F6 for black and 3 C5 for black. But on this side, we'll look at some of the slightly less regular ones, which of course the player of the white pieces must be acquainted with. And we'll start with the move 3 D takes E4 for black. Now this constitutes the Rubinstein variation of the French defense. And of course black can play it after the move 3 knight C3 instead of 3 knight D2. Of course white will recapture on move 4. And black will often play the move 4 knight D7 here, to preface putting his knight on F6. He wants to recapture with a knight if should white take there. And I'm going to advocate a very simple system of development for white here. There are many sharper possibilities, but I'm going to recommend a very simple one where white just concentrates on simple development, castling kingside and retaining a slight spatial advantage due to his extra pawn in the center. The whimsical point was pointed out to me by the player of the Rubinstein defense, G.D. Lee from England, that people who play 3 knight to C3 tend to castle queenside, and people who play 3 knight to D2 tend to castle kingside. There's perhaps more than a grain of truth in that. Anyway, after the move 3 pawn takes pawn, knight takes E4, knight D7, I suggest the move 5 knight to F3 for white. Now black will almost certainly play the move knight from G8 to F6 here. He can finesse. The move bishop to E7, for instance, was played against me by Peter Clark in the British Championship 1978. And I carried on with a very natural move, bishop D3. I think this is far and away the most natural square for the bishop. And black then played knight to F6, king's knight to F6. I then exchanged, and he took with a bishop. And now, instead of castling immediately, I played the slight finesse queen E2. And the idea behind queen E2 is that should black now castle kingside, I think white could continue in slugger fashion with queen E4, of course forcing the move G6, and then bishop to H6, followed by H4 and H5, and castling queenside, white has an automatic attack. And so after the move queen E2, Clark did not castle kingside. He played the move queen E7, a finesse in the Petrosian style he envies so much. I then castled kingside. Black played C5. I played very quietly. I played C3 here. Black castled kingside. And then I played bishop E3. And white was slightly more comfortable. Slightly in development, more space. On the whole, this is a fair assessment of the Rubinstein variation. White isn't going to develop a tremendous advantage out of it. It's something that if he plays in the quiet fashion I'm recommending, but he can count on a small but tangible advantage in almost all variations. Now please return to the position of diagram 2. And black plays knight Gf6. And white will reply now with a move knight takes knight check. To take with a queen would be rather dangerous for black here, because after the move bishop D3 in reply, white would immediately be threatening bishop S6. Bishop G5, beg your pardon, trapping the queen. So Knight takes knight in recapture for black. And now carrying on with this simple plan, 7, bishop d3 for white, sending simply to castle kingside. And my game with Graham Lee from the British Championship 1978, he now played bishop e7. White played 8 castles, black played likewise 8 castles. White played 9 queen e2. And black played the move b6, which is predictable because one might expect him to fianchetto that queen's bishop, the only way to activate it. And now my next move, 10 bishop f4, is important, I think, because after 10 bishop f4, black played 10 bishop b7, and I played 11 c3. Black would like to play the maneuver queen d5 to h5, after which white would always have to reckon with the doubling of his king's bishop pawn. But the move queen d5 here, of course, is not possible because of the simple reply bishop takes c7. And therefore, in order to continue development, black played the move c5. But this perhaps opens up the game a little earlier than he would like. I transform the pawn structure. I played 12 d takes on c5. Black recaptured with a pawn. B takes on c5. I played rook a to d1. 13th move, rook a to d1. Of course, threatening bishop takes pawn check, winning the queen. So black moved the queen to the most likely square, queen b6. Now after knight to e5, I think we can stop analysing the opening here and conclude that white has a slight advantage in view of his superior pawn structure. He has only 2 pawn islands and black has 3 pawn islands. Isolated queen's bishop pawn for black could well prove a weakness, and in particular the square queen bishop 4 for white is a very nice outpost. White is considerably more comfortably off here. If you would like to refer to the position in diagram 3 on the accompanying sheet, I'd like to mention the game where black recaptured with the bishop. Instead of playing b takes on c5, he played bishop takes on c5. As I mentioned, when black played the move c5, I thought he was opening the game up a little earlier than he should have done, because white is a little better developed and is able to connect his rooks. Indeed, with the next move, rook a to d1, as after the recapture with the pawn, white is threatening to win the black queen with bishop takes h7 check. And clearly this is quite a transparent threat. In the game, my opponent decided to avoid it by moving his queen. But if you look at the position, you'll find it's not so easy to move the queen. If you play queen to e7, white can win a piece with the move b4, since the black bishop is attacked and has only one square, d6. Upon bishop d6, white can simply play bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and then bishop takes h7 check will work, winning the queen. And so to avoid this annoying discovered check, black was forced to put the queen on the most unlikely looking square. He played queen to e8. And now white continued very naturally with the move knight e5. And the possibility of bishop b5 harassing the black queen still further was extremely annoying to black, so he played the move a6. But clearly moves such as queen e8 and a6 are not in the spirit of a harmonious development. I played the move bishop g5 now in this game against a player rated about 190. I beg his pardon, I can't remember his name. And now black wanted to avoid the doubling of his king-bishop pawns. But already he has a lot of problems defending the position. Upon knight d5, there's a possible continuation c4. And if knight to b4, then white can play the move knight to d7. Simply threatening knight takes f8, winning the exchange. And black, of course, can't play queen takes d7 because of the recurrent threat bishop takes h7 check. In fact, in the game, my opponent overlooked this theme in yet a different disguise. After bishop g5, he did not play knight to d5. He played bishop back to e7 to protect the doubling of his king-bishop pawns. But now white quite simply played bishop takes knight. Black recaptured with the bishop. And then knight to d7, winning the exchange because his queen takes d7. At the risk of boredom, bishop takes h7 check will win the queen. In fact, black resigned here. And those two short games I've shown you, and it's hardly an exhaustive analysis of the Rubinstein defence. It doesn't claim to be. I don't think the Rubinstein defence is the kind of opening that should command too much theoretical attention from the player of the white pieces. Just simple economical development like that will grant you a slight but sure advantage. If you would like to return to diagram 1, we'll look at another variation now. The move 3, bishop to e7 for black, a non-committal move. And indeed, were it played by a minor master player, I think the move would not have commanded much attention from theatricians. And in fact, the move was played by the Russian Grandmaster Oleg Romanishin, who has scored many fine successes with it in the very top international tournaments. So we must look at this move with a degree of seriousness. The move doesn't strike at the white centre at all. There's no immediate threat, as there would be after the move 3 knight f6 or 3 knight c6 or 3 f5. So white can choose between a number of development systems. I think you'll agree the most natural move in reply to 3 bishop e7 is 4 king's knight to f3. This is the move I'm going to advocate. I think if black were now to play c5, white could simply play e takes d5, e takes d5, d takes c5 to gain a tempo on many of the variations we'll see in side 2 when black plays the immediate 3 c5. And so the most natural move, it seems, for black would be 4 knight f6, threatening to win a pawn. And so, of course, white will push on with e5. We would not expect white to get any advantage at all from taking on d5, so e5. And now knight f to d7. And now white continues with simply bishop d3. And black will almost certainly try to strike at the white centre here with c5. Then c3 for white. And then knight c6 seems consistent for black. And then castles for white. And I think I'm going to defer analysing this position any further, because it's highly similar to what we'll be seeing on side 2, when we'll be looking at a pawn gambit against the move 3 knight to f6. And this position is extremely similar to that. But I think the move bishop e7, which black has played, will prove to be superfluous in this particular structure. So this move 3 bishop e7, popularized by Oleg Romanishin, I'm going to leave any further analysis of this until the second side, when I'll refer back to it in my analysis of many analogous systems against the move 3 knight to f6. At the moment, suffice to say, we're just going to play 4 king's knight to the bishop 3 against it. Another slightly unusual alternative on the third move for black is to play the move 3 knight to e7. Now, as with the previous move, bishop to e7, this move again does not contain any direct threat. However, that does not mean it flaunts opening principles. Again, I think white should continue in simple developing fashion with the move 4 knight from g to f3. Now black will usually play the move knight g6 here, and this move is in accordance with the system knight e7, inasmuch as knight e7 can be referred to as a system. And the point is that should white now play the bishop to d3 or e2, the reply knight f4 might well be rather annoying. There's no way for white to profitably keep his bishop, apart from the retrograde bishop to f1. And so white might well consider fianchetting the king's bishop in this position. And he also might consider prefacing that fianchetto with the move 5 h4. Now h4 may seem to be a little contrary to opening principles, but it's not really that bad, because should white be able to play h5, the black knight can't, of course, then go to f4 because the simple reply g3 trapping it. It may well go back to e7 then. And for instance, after the move h4, I played a game with the international master Sean Talbot, who played c5 against me now. I then played h5, he played knight to e7. And then I played the move c3, which I don't necessarily think was the best. I think white should have played the move e5 there. And this pawn advance to h5 is extremely annoying for black. And that white would play the move h6 next move, given the opportunity. And in that closed situation, with black's pawns fixed on white squares, to have this rupture of his king side would be extremely weakening. So if we now go back to diagram 3a after 5h4, the reply 5h5 is by no means as silly as one might think, because to allow h5 and h6 with tempo, kicking that knight away, really robs black's idea knight e7 to g6 of any purpose whatsoever. So after the interpolation of these two rook pawn moves, h4, h5, in a game between Silvino Garcia, Cuban international master, and Guillermo Garcia, Cuban grandmaster, white played the move 6g3, consistent with his idea of fianchetting the king's bishop, and also deadening that black knight, since white now has pawn control of the important square f4. While black, as we might expect, did something in the middle. He played the move 6c5, and white carried on with bishop g2. And if you look at the position, I'm sure you can see that any pawn exchange in the center will leave white by no means worse off. And now black played the move knight c6, which white did not choose to ignore. He played the move e takes d5. And should black recapture with a pawn here, by castling or following up with rook e1, white will get a very comfortable game. His pawn of h4, this eccentricity in the opening, is quite solid and defended by the pawn at g3. But black's pawn is not. And were he to recapture with the e-pawn here, he might well experience great difficulty in castling kingside, given that vulnerable h-pawn. And so he recaptured with the queen after e takes d5. Queen takes d5, black plays. And white hoped to profit from this early queen development by playing castles, which is a gambit. Because black played the move knight takes d4. White played knight takes d4. Black took with the queen on d4. Now white simply played queen e2. And it's safe to say that white has a great deal of dangerous compensation here for this pawn. He already has a lead in development, and black has lost time by grabbing material with his queen, and indeed will lose further time. That queen is an object of attack, and very natural moves by white. After knight to e4 from white, move rook d1 will gain time. And it's safe to stop the analysis here and conclude that white has considerable compensation for that pawn. In fact, he won this game in crushing style. An interesting new idea, 3 knight e7. Best met, I think, by king's knight to bishop 3, knight to g6, and h4. Another offbeat alternative for black at the third move is to play the move 3 f5. Now this move does appear to be slightly contrary to principle in that after white exchanges a pawn, as he almost certainly will do here, black will be left with a weakness at e5. And this is not necessarily fatal, because one could think of, again, if we look for analogies in the opening, we can find an analogy here with the Petrov defense. Because often in variations of the Petrov defense, black will play f5 and d5. And this, of course, leaves him with a weak square at e5. But as compensation for that, he has an outpost, a very readily available outpost for his knight at e4. Now the knight is not totally inviolate at e4, since white can, in theory, kick it away with f3. But to actually arrange favourable conditions for that move f3 is by no means easy. And so the move f5 deserves attention. Now the reply e5 is not really an attempt to refute the opening. After c5, black has a normal type of French defence position, and the interpolation with the pawn move f5 hasn't done him any harm. And so the correct move would seem to be e takes f5. e takes d5 would be the same thing, I would imagine. I can't see black recapturing with the queen there. And so e takes f5. And of course, black will recapture. And now there are several natural-looking moves here to bring the king's knight out. Play bishop d3. These both seem natural moves. Let's look at the way the world champion handled this position in 1972. Only time he faced it when, of course, Karpov was not the actual world champion there. He played the move 5, knight from d2 to f3. This is a theme we'll often see in the Tarrasch defense of black putting the queen's knight onto f3 and often bringing the king's knight onto e2. And black played the natural move 5, knight f6. And Karpov's sixth move, bishop to g5, is an interesting treatment of the opening. Remember what I previously said about the square e4, that being an outpost for a knight, being one of the main boons for black in this structure. But now to achieve the move knight e4, of course it's immediately impossible, might be difficult for black, since he might have to play a6, constituting a weakening of his king side. He played bishop e7 to break that pin, and Karpov played bishop d3. But now another point of this move, 6 bishop g5, is revealed, in that when black moves this knight to e4, he will allow a exchange of dark squared bishops, and of course a consequent weakening of his dark squares in this position. And with his pawns placed on light squares, this means that the dark squares are very vulnerable. So he played the move knight e4, and Karpov exchanged on e7, and black took with e7, perhaps agreeing with my assessment that his dark squares were vulnerable, but hoping to get good play, since he now threatens to make a move such as knight to c3 check, winning the queen, and also has the subsequent threat queen b4 check, picking up the b pawn. Well, the first threat is of course very serious, but the second one puts the black queen out of play and constitutes pawn grabbing. So Karpov played the move knight e2 here. And now his opponent quite rightly did not play queen to b4 check, because after c3, queen takes b2, castles, white would have classical compensation for a pawn, in that black has developed no pieces at all except for his queen and his king knight, has put his queen completely out of play, and runs great risks of suffering as a result. Classical compensation for a pawn there. And so his opponent castled here with move 9 with black, and Karpov did likewise. And I think we can stop here and conclude that white has come out of the opening with a very satisfactory position. In particular, this square e5 beckons as a very nice outpost for the knight. Another middle game plan, and again we can point out the similarity to a Petrov defense there, is the move c4 for white, which will undermine that knight outpost at e4 for black, and often remove the last black pawn from the center, the last extension in the center for black. This position after 10 castles we can call diagram 4, and here we'll leave off our analysis of the move 3f5. Let's now return to diagram 1 and look at another alternative on the third move for black. And continuing, I'll look at slightly unusual third moves. The move, if you go back to diagram 1, the move 3a6 for black has been played in Grandmaster chess. One of the ideas of this move is to avoid the white bishop coming to b5, and also should white play c4 at some later stage. Why should want to, I can't think, but should he play c4 at some later stage, black might then take on c4, white could recapture with a bishop, and black play b5, hitting the bishop. Another supposed idea behind the move 3a6 is that it provides a niche for the black king bishop on a7. Clearly, however, this move doesn't contribute too much to the black development. I don't think one should be too worried about it. I'm going to look at two Grandmaster games here. where the move 3a6 was played. And also mention one of my own. And, as we're used to against these unusual moves, the move 4, knight from g to f3, is often played. Consistent logical move continuing the flow of white's development. And the only really consistent move for black, from what we've been talking about, is to play the move c5. And against this move, white can play 5, e takes d5. Should black recapture with the queen, he would run into bishop c4 or c4, gaining time against this queen. The move queen takes d5 is bad there in accordance with the principle that early queen developments are bad. Well-known principle. So black plays the move 5, e takes d5. And white will now play 6. D takes on c5. Black recaptures, bishop takes c5. And this middle game, with the isolated queen's pawn for black, we should be encountering time and time again, particularly in our analysis of the move 3c5 on the next side of the cassette. And it's important to talk now about the strengths and weaknesses of an isolated queen's pawn. There is a point of view held by many players, even up to very high grades, British 200 strength or ELO 2200, that the isolated queen's pawn is just a weakness. Now this is obviously too simplified a view. One must go into greater depth as to when it's good and when it's bad. The pawn in itself cannot be defended by a pawn. It's isolated. And thus when attacked, it must be either defended by pieces or, and this is important, that attack must be ignored. Some counter-attack initiated by the player of the black piece. But the weakness of the pawn in itself is not the main drawback of the isolated queen's pawn as it's considered by theoreticians and chess strategists. It is the weakness of the square in front of it, which provides a base, in particular for a white knight, where it is totally inviolate. It can never be shifted from that square. Now it is important if black is going to get a good game with an isolated queen's pawn, or indeed in any middle game where white should have one, to generate enough play with his pieces to compensate for the weakness of that pawn. Now, an important feature of the pawn is that it gives a possible knight outpost at the square e4, and this is very readily appreciated by many weak players. But what isn't so readily appreciated is that the pawn also gives an outpost at the square c4 for a knight. And in some middle games we'll be examining, this is quite important, the fact that black can use that square. In this particular position on the seventh move, a very natural move for white is to play the move 7 knight b3, which gets the knight out of the way, clears a line for the queen's bishop, and has the virtue of gaining time since that bishop is attacked on c5. And in the game between the two grandmasters, Maciulowicz from Yugoslavia and Anderson from Sweden, played in 1978, black retreated the bishop to b6 here. And Maciulowicz could well have played a move of his king's bishop in this position, but he chose the slightly novel move, bishop to g5. A developing move, attacking the black queen, of course. And were black to play f6 now, this would constitute a definite weakening of his position, and white would simply retreat to f4. So black interpolated his knight to e7. And Maciulowicz now played the move 9 queen d2. Slightly novel setup. And Anderson played his queen's knight out to c6. And Maciulowicz had to decide where to put his king's bishop in this position, on e2 or on d3, and he chose bishop e2. The move bishop d3 certainly came into consideration. In his 10th move here, Anderson castled. On his 11th move, Machulovic also castled. And now the move h6 was played to challenge this white bishop. The white might well have considered exchanging on e7 here. The bishop takes e7. Whichever way black recaptures, white can't win that queen's pawn. But the loss of the two bishops is not necessarily tragic in the resulting middle games. Instead, Anderson chose the equally natural move, and probably superior move, bishop to e3. Remembering what I said earlier about the activity of the pieces being necessary to compensate for the weakness of this isolated queen's pawn, this move, bishop e3, challenges the most active black piece on the board, the king bishop. With its removal, we might hope that white would achieve a simplification and move on in his efforts to exploit this weak queen's pawn. It's perhaps a dangerous generalization, but I think one can say that with every piece of exchange, the weaknesses of this isolated queen's pawn is amplified. Black played 12, rook e8. White replied 13, rook a to d1. And now black played the move played the move 13, bishop to g4. A suggested improvement here, again going along with this principle of the necessity to have active piece play, was the move 13, knight to f5. And clearly white is forced to play bishop takes on b6 after that move. Black can then recapture. And the queen's pawn cannot be taken because of the counter-attack, a theme I mentioned earlier. If queen takes d5, black can of course play rook takes bishop on e2. And so there, black with his pieces quite actively placed, knight and f5 is active, and queen is active, and bishop e6 to follow up, would well have had enough activity to compensate for that queen's pawn. He in fact chose the inferior move, bishop g4, and now white simply continue with 14, rook f to e1. And here we can leave off our discussion of the opening, since white has moved and posted all his pieces. And this type of very comfortable middle game with this isolated queen's pawn as a permanent headache for black is what attracts so many players of the white pieces to the Tarrasch variation of the French defense. Let's return now to diagram 1 and we'll examine another game in this variation with the move 3a6. This time an example of the world champion Anatoly Karpov playing. In this game with the Soviet master Rafael Vahanyan from a tournament at Skopje, 1976. Black in fact played the move order 3c5, if we soon transpose, because white played 4, e takes d5, black replied e takes d5, white played knight g to f3, and then black played this characteristic move a6. And Karpov chose to take on c5 here, immediately saddling black with that isolated queen's pawn. And Vahanyan recaptured. And Karpov now played, as did Machulovic in the previous game, knight b3. Anderson retreated to b6. And instead of the move 8, bishop g5, to follow it with queen d2 and bishop d2, as Machulovic did, Karpov chose a slightly different system of development, a more direct move. He plays bishop d3 now. And black played knight to e7. Black might well have considered disrupting the flow of white's development with the move queen e7 check here, after which white would probably have to go into an endgame with queen e2, but he should have no fears in that resulting endgame because of the, or shall we say, queenless middle game, because of that isolated queen's pawn, always likely to confer an advantage to him. In fact, behind him played the move knight e7. And Karpov continued with the easy, natural, simple moves to find 9 castles. Black played knight from b8 to c6. Karpov occupied the open file with his rook, rook e1. And Black played the move bishop g4. And this move bishop g4 is often, we see Black, this is the most active deployment of his queen's bishop in the system. And he's trying to aggravate white. He may even remove that knight. It's such an important control of the important d4 square. The squares d4 and d5 are absolutely crucial in this position. Karpov played the moves 11 c3. And note there was a slight tactical point here that Black cannot castle now because of the reply of bishop takes h7 check. He played h6, a finesse to avoid that, prepare castling. Karpov played 12 h3, putting the question to the bishop. Black replied bishop h5. And Karpov played bishop e3, again challenging the most active piece, as did behind him, as did, I beg your pardon, Machurovich in the previous game. So now Black castled. On his 14th move, Karpov took on b6. Black recaptured. And we can leave the game here. If you want to refer to the continuation of this very interesting and finely played game by Karpov, you'll find it in the accompanying booklet. Another example of playing against the move 3a6 is one of my own games from the tournament in London. I again played 4. Knight from g1 to f3. Black again played c5. And now, instead of the move e takes d5, I chose the slightly more novel move c3. This is perhaps of some theoretical interest. Black played knight c6. I played bishop to d3. And now Black played knight f6. And after e5, knight d7. Castles. We again have a position which is analogous to the pawn sacrifice you'll find recommended on the second side against the move 3 knight f6. But whereas in that variation Black will have played the useful move queen to b6, he has here played the rather much less useful move a6. And so Black does not stand so well. This is another alternative method of meeting the move 3a6. To return to diagram 1 again, another not so popular but hard to refute move is the move 3b6, which has only been seen, to my knowledge, about once in Grandmaster chess. This occurs in the game Miles Nikolach, Vikings 1979. Now the move b6 clearly intends a queenside fianchetto. And Miles played the move 3 e takes d5 here, hoping that in this position, which of course resembles the 3 e takes d5 exchange variation of the French defense, that bishop might prove misplaced. It's not entirely clear his argument worked, and one might well contemplate more straightforward development with the old favourite knight g to f3, answering bishop b7 with bishop d3, or perhaps e5, entering a closed formation, or perhaps e takes d5, according to one's taste. But let's look at this interesting game, Miles Nikolach. He played 4 e takes d5. Nikolach took with a pawn. Taking with the queen looks as though it would become a target after the reply knight gf3, followed by bishop c4 or c4. And now Miles played on his 5th move, knight from d2 to f3. And Nikolach played bishop d6. Miles played bishop d3. And now Nikolach made a mockery of his 3rd move, but since Miles exchanged pawns, the structure has changed somewhat. He played 6, bishop to g4. Miles adopted a plan trying to weaken and exploit the weakness of the black king side. He played the move 7c3, knight to d7, queen to c2, beg your pardon. Black played knight g to f6. And here comes this move 9 bishop g5, consistent with this idea of trying to weaken the black king side light squares. Miles intends to follow it with the move bishop f5 at some stage. It's rather a novel approach to the position. Miles likes to simplify positions when he can, these kind of endgame structures. Black played 9 h6, and having achieved his desired weakening, Miles came back with 10 bishop e3. Now Nicolai played c5. Miles played h3. And Nicolai retreated to e6 with his bishop. And now Miles developed his last minor piece with knight to e2. And Nicolai chose to play c4 here. And of course, Miles replies false, bishop to f5. On his 13th move, Nicolai took on f5. And Miles replied queen takes f5. And the consequences of this opening, this rather unusual opening, have not been all that bad for Black. Black could now continue with queen c7 or queen e7 to e6. It stood no worse. He played the move g6, which perhaps gave White a tiny advantage due to those advanced kingside pawns. Hardly anything tangible though. And so this is the only occurrence I know of this slightly strange move 3b6 in the French defence. And I'm not sure that Miles' treatment of e takes d5 was slightly too simplified to hope for much of an advantage. I think I'd recommend the move 4, king's knight to bishop 3 in conjunction with bishop to queen 3 there is more likely to retain something for White. So that was 3b6. Now let's look at perhaps the most respected of these slightly unusual alternatives for Black at the third move. Remember, we consider 3c5 and 3 knight f6 as the most usual. Now that is the move 3 knight to c6, the Guimard variation of the Tarrasche defence, so named after an Argentinian master who popularized and developed the system in the 40s and 50s. The move seems contrary to opening principles, inasmuch as Black often wants to move that c-pawn in the French defence. The move c5 so often occurs in this opening, and the move knight c6, putting the knight in front of it, seems to make that very hard to achieve for Black. And indeed, for that rather simple reason, the move has never really caught on at the highest levels of the game. Some grandmasters, Petrosian has occasionally played it. Robert Hubner, the West German, who reached the final of the candidates this year, has used the move, but it's never really caught on. Now, we're White to play the move c3 now, in response to this attack on his queen's pawn. The move e5 cleanses the centre completely of pawns and equalizes for Black. So the only move to play for an advantage is the move knight g to f3, standard fourth move for White. And now we'll Black to exchange on e4. So after knight takes pawn, we simply have an inferior variation of the Rubinstein variation, the first one we looked at, and the Black can't play c5 very easily. And so Black almost always plays the move knight f6 now. And White responds to this attack on his pawn with e5. Bishop d3 would be a very bad move now, because Black could play the move knight b4 in response, and I'm sure if you look at this you'll see it's very good for Black. So e5. Black plays his knight to d7. And now theory has analysed in some depth the moves knight b3 here and move 6, or 6 bishop to queen's knight 5, or 6 bishop to king 2. I'm going to advocate a move which isn't very often seen at master level. And as in previous moves I've used on this cassette, it does offer transposition to a pawn sacrifice, which we will find analysed in the 3 knight to f6 variation on the second side of the cassette. And that is the move 6 bishop to d3. Now this move was not played. It's the most natural square for the bishop. It was not played at Grandmaster chess for quite a while because of the reply knight b4. And that king's bishop is such importance to white that he must move it, of course. And then it was felt that black could just follow up with c5 and it had been given a useful tempo to achieve his desirable move c5. I'm going to quickly dispense with this move 6 knight to b4 because there's an interesting transposition here and quite important one. After 6 knight b4, let's say white simply retreats with 7 bishop e2. And now to give any meaning whatsoever to his last move, black must play c5 with move 7. Then white can play 8 c3. Black retreats to c6. And then by simply moving his bishop to d3, white has transposed to this pawn sacrifice we'll look at on the other side of the cassette. Each side has an increased pair of, as an extra pair of moves, but this of course is of no consequence. So in response to knight b4, bishop e2, c5, c3, knight c6, bishop d3, and this position is analysed on the next side of the cassette. Alternatives for black, such as bishop e7, don't put enough pressure on the white centre, and simply continuing with c3, like it's a very good game. So the only real alternative to the move 6 knight b4, and I must stress that is the one most grandmasters advocate, is the move 6 f6. Now white could possibly exchange here, but by recapturing with the queen, black quickly establishes a swift development with bishop d6 and castles, and shouldn't have too much difficulty in equalizing. But there was a very interesting possibility after the move 6 f6, and that is the outlandish looking move 7 knight to g5. And now if black was to play f takes g5, white would of course play the only consistent move, queen to h5 check. Now things are by no means easy for black. If he plays g6, white carries on in romantic fashion with bishop takes g6 check, h takes g6 check. And now he doesn't take the rook but plays queen takes g6 check, king e7, knight to e4, brilliant move. Now black must do something about this check on g5, so if bishop h6, then bishop takes g5 check, bishop takes g5. Now the very nice interpolation, queen to g7 check, king to e8. And white picks up most of the black pieces as queen takes h8 check, knight to f8, queen h5 check, winning that bishop. A very beautiful sequence of moves. If we go back to diagram 5 after the move 7 knight g5, let's look again at this possibility of black capturing on g5. Again, white plays queen h5 check, and now not g6, but king e7 immediately. And you will find an interesting game from this position in the enclosed booklet. You might like to analyse for yourself what's going on in this position and how white can justify this temporary piece sacrifice. And after you have done so, you will continue analysing on side 2. Tarrasche defence, side 2. If we look again at diagram 5, we're now going to analyse the move knight on d7 takes on e5 for black. Now this move doesn't appear obvious at first sight, but since we've just had a look at the obvious move, f takes on g5, and found this not to be satisfactory for black, we must look at alternatives. So after knight d takes on e5, white must be captured as knight. So the d pawn takes on e5. And then black will capture on g5. And so he is at present a pawn up. Well, in order to justify this pawn sacrifice, white must be consistent and play queen h5 check. And now there are two moves in this position. The obvious move is to play king to d7. Now black has forfeited casting rights and may have some problems with king stuck in the centre, but does have an extra pawn. And we'll look at the game Nunn versus Short in the British Championship in 1979 in that line. The other move, a rather silly move, is to play g6. This is the first move we'll look at. This game was played, an obscure game between Fibosic and Monin, two Russian players. And the point of the move g6 presumably is to misplace the white pieces. White must, of course, play bishop takes g6 check. And now black would be stupid to recapture because white would just take his rook. So he plays king to d7 now. And so now the material is equal, and the position is not entirely clear. The black king stuck in the centre. The white piece is possibly attacking him, possibly misplaced on the king side. This was the assessment Monin thought, at least. In this game, on his 11th move, white played f4. And the idea is clear, to open up lines, in particular the f file, and try and exploit this slightly uncomfortable king's position for black. Note the move knight f3, or move 11 for white, a very tempting move, loses to pawn takes bishop, queen takes on h8, bishop to b4 check, with discovered attack on the queen. After f4, white played g takes f4 in this game, and where he could play such moves as bishop c5, white would of course retreat that now attacks bishop from g6 to d3. With a similar type of position to the one we have in the game. So f4, g takes on f4. White played the bishop back to d3, since eventually it must be attacked on that square on g6 when the black king bishop moves. And now black played knight b4. If he plays, for instance, bishop g7, and knight to f3 will give white an excellent game. He's bound to recapture that pawn on f4 at some stage. The game Fibosic Monin. White now continue with the move 13, knight to f3. I'm not going to recommend this move. Let's just look at the course of the game after 13, knight f3. Black took on d3 with check. White, of course, recaptured. Black played 14 b6, preparing to organise his queenside pieces. White played 15 bishop takes on f4, re-establishing material equality. And black played 15 bishop a6, attacking the white queen's pawn. White now castled queenside. And after black's move 16 queen to e8, he was on the way to unravelling his position, and in the long term his chances are superior against the two bishops. The centralised king might prove very well placed in an endgame situation. After the move queen e8, white moved his queen away, and black succeeded in organising his position with c5, moving his king over to the queen side. So it seems that perhaps the plausible move 13 knight f3 was not quite immediate enough for this sharp situation. So I'm going to recommend the move 13 castles for white in that position. So from the position given as diagram 6, and so 13 castles for white, with the idea of completing development swiftly, perhaps at the cost of a pawn, and trying to get some play against the black king. So I don't feel that white should lose a pawn in this situation. The only material he's damaged is pawn of f4, which is, I'm sure you can see, is not the strongest pawn in the world. This position, as far as I know, hasn't arisen in master chess. I think white's chances are very good for this pawn. The idea of rook takes f4, followed by rook into f6. I'm going to examine one possible continuation for black here. I don't pretend it to be an exhaustive analysis. I think it's just indicative of the kind of possibilities white has in this position where black's king-queen side pieces are still a bit jumbled up and his king is misplaced. And that's the move 13 bishop c5 check. Well, clearly white has only one response to 13 bishop c5 check, that's 14 king h1. And now the move bishop e3 for black, trying to prevent white from regaining that pawn, and if he does so, at the cost of exchanging off some attacking pieces. So the only consistent move now for white is to play 15, knight to b3. And now that's the continuation. Knight takes on d3. Pawn takes on d3. I think we can stop here and say that white has very, very good chances. He's almost certainly going to recover his pawn. And the resulting situation, black is behind in development, somewhat jammed up. And so I think the possibility of 13 castles, in preference to the move 13 knight f3, is played in this only theoretical game we have available, 5 Bisevich Monin. And a slightly obscure line was from diagram 5, knight g5. Gives white some interesting and probably good attacking possibilities. Now the other game, again going back to diagram 5, with knight d takes on e5, was a game played in the British Championship 1979 in the penultimate round between Grandmaster John Nunn and the Wunderkind Nigel Short. Now, I recommended the move 6 bishop d3 to Nunn about a month before this game at the Claire Benedict tournament, because of the interesting transpositional possibility to the gambit line, which we'll find analysed later in the tape. And Nunn played it for the first time, as far as I know, against Short. Short played the move, as we know, 6f6, 7 knight g5, arriving at diagram 5. Now Short did as Monin did. He played 7 knight from d7 takes on e5. White played d takes on e5. And black played f takes on g5. And white played queen h5 check. All as in the game 5 Bisevich Monin. But now Short didn't play his supposed finesse g6, which as we've seen isn't entirely sensible for black. He played king d7 with a similar type of position to the one that Monin got, except that black has the compensation of an extra pawn. So white, of course, followed up with the move 10, knight to f3. And so Short played the move g6 here. Had he chosen to try and preserve the pawn with h6, note that white can't play bishop takes g5 then, because of h takes g5, queen takes h8, bishop b4 check, winning the queen. After the move h6, one would have to content himself with 11 h4. After g takes h4, rook takes h4. The position isn't entirely clear, but white does have a lot of chances against that unplaced white king, even though he has a clear pawn down. This is a very interesting gambit. I recommend you look at this yourself, try and get some conclusions. Short played the move g6. This is a slightly different move order than Monin, and white could not transpose to the Monin game with bishop takes g6, because of the reply h takes g6, queen takes h8, bishop b4 check. A theme I'm sure we're all familiar with right now. So he played g6 and Nunn didn't take it. He played queen to g4. He could have regained material equality with queen takes g5, but after queen takes g5 by black, bishop takes g5, bishop g7, black would certainly be no worse. And after queen g4, Short played 11, bishop to e7. And then played knight takes g5, now attacking the e6 pawn. So to protect it, Short played the unlikely looking move, queen to g8. Now here in the game, Nunn played the move 13 Queen A4. Now, the situation must have been new to both players at the time. I very much doubt whether either had analysed this position before the game. I'm not at all sure that Queen A4 is correct here. Possibly the simple move F4. White has material equality. Black can probably pick off the white squared bishop with knight to b4 takes d3. But even so, in the resulting position, Black is still a little disjointed and uncoordinated with his king and d7. So 13 f4 may well be an improvement here. Also, simply coming back to f3 with a knight suggests itself. Anyway, after 13 Queen A4, the only game we have, Nunn short, so H6 was played. And of course, he played the knight back to F3. And the short broke the pin with King D8. It's an unusual play. Nunn played bishop to D2. Short played G5. An unusual position, but the threat of G4 winning a pawn forces White to take time out for H3. Now short played Queen G7. Nunn castle queenside. 17th move for White, castles queenside. Short played 17 rook F8. Nunn played rook H2 E1. And now short carried on his development with bishop to B7. For his 19th move, Nunn played 19 bishop to B5. And after A6 from short, he took on C6, and I don't understand this maneuver at all. I think a more natural move for White here was to play the move 19 Queen to G4, with the positional and tactical threat of playing H4. Either winning that King's Knight pawn or isolating it for Black, leaving it a big weakness, and White can then use the H file. I think the move 19 Queen G4 here might well have given White the advantage. The continuation 19 bishop to B5 is played after A6, bishop takes C6, bishop takes C6, Queen B3, King to C8. Despite all these king moves, Black was in a very robust position. In fact, Nunn agreed to draw at move 24 of this game. I managed it slightly worse when he did so. So I think with that game we'll leave off our analysis of this move knight C6, the Grimard variation. It's a slightly novel suggestion. I don't think you'll find 6 bishop D3 recommended in many opening books. The Encyclopedia of Chess Opening doesn't even mention the move 6 bishop D3. Presumably because of the strength of the reply knight b4. But as we've shown, there's a possibility of strong gambit play for White there. So this is an interesting new possibility. Now let's move on to the analysis of one of the principal third moves for Black. That's 3 knight to f6. Now the universally played move now is e5. And Black will usually respond with knight f to d7. The move knight g8 is a little retrograde, and White should just follow up simply with bishop d3, knight to e2, and c3 as a system of development. And again, a small advantage. The knight isn't very, as you might expect, is rather passively placed there. So e5, knight f to d7, and now the move bishop d3. Now Black will almost always play c5 here, and follow up with the plan of knight c6 and f6, possibly hitting the white centre. But instead of c5, there is the move b6, which you will find, we're not going to analyse it on the tapes, it's rather a sub-variation, which you'll find the enclosed game Ivanovich-Anderson from Nick 6, 1978. It's an example of White play against this. Please note the move knight to h3 for White in this game. And so after c5, White plays c3, and black plays knight c6. The usually played move here is knight to e2, and then moving the queen's knight round to f3. I think I mentioned this kind of idea earlier on in the tape. But the move 7, knight g to f3, which is played with a pawn sacrifice in mind, has been known for some time. This move was analysed in great depth by the Grandmaster John Nunn. I agree almost entirely with his assessments, but with one or two changes and also some additional material. So we'll look at it here, this idea of sacrificing a pawn with knight g to f3. You'll find this is diagram 7. Now black try and take this pawn with queen b6, after which white intends to castle, gambling that pawn. Or has various means of declining the pawn. We'll look at queen b6 first. So the move 7, queen b6, and white plays 8 castles. Now black plays c takes d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, 11, knight to f3. And now black should retreat with the queen to b6, as he almost universally does. To play it anywhere else, to g4 for instance, it might get into trouble after h3, queen to h5, rook e1, the simple idea of king h2 and g4, ensnaring that queen. But I think if you look at the position, you'll agree it's not very comfortably placed there. And after queen to b6, move queen to c2. Now white clearly threatens to take that h-pawn off now. And if black plays g6, then simply bishop f4. And if bishop c5, rook a to c1. And white has very good positional compensation for the pawn, and you have that serious weakening of the king's side dark squares with g6. So the two main moves that have crystallized this theory are the moves 12 h6 and 12 queen c5. Look at 12 h6 first. White carries on trying to exploit his leading development as compensation for the gambit with the move 13, bishop to f4. Now, were black to play provocatively with g5 here, that would constitute a serious weakening of his position. By replying bishop to e3, white would gain a very good initiative. The game Nunn vs. Mrudja from Lublin 1978 continued bishop c5, rook a to e1, bishop takes on e3, 16 rook takes on e3, and Nunn pointed out the possibility of even taking with a pawn here to open up the f-file. But he plays 16 rook takes e3, 16 g4, knight d2. And clearly black is going to have a great deal of difficulty in developing his pieces here, in view of those terrible weaknesses on the king's side. So from diagram 8, after white's bishop f4, the move knight c5 certainly comes into consideration. The game Nunn-Whiteley from 1978 continued 14 bishop to e3 there. And Whiteley played queen a5, which is an inaccuracy, allowing his very alert opponent to play the very sharp move 15 b4. And after queen takes b4, 16 rook a b1, queen a3, bishop b5 check, king to d8. If bishop d7, white could take on c5. Take on d7, take on b7, check. 17 king to d8. You've got 18 rook f to c1. So of course black's reply is clearly force b6. And now Nunn simply play rook b3, trapping and winning the black queen. But this is by far the whole story of this gambit, which is not totally worked out by theory yet, and the results aren't entirely clear. So after the move, if you go back to diagram 8, knight c5, bishop e3, black might would have tried bishop d7, or queen to b4. And we cannot say the consequences of the gambit are entirely favourable to white or clear. White might well consider playing bishop to e2 then, after queen to b4. This was certainly a superior defensive try. To go back to diagram 8, after 13 bishop to f4, my game with the Indian international master Ravi Kumar in 1979 continued 13 queen to b4. Since my bishop was attacked, I had to retreat it, so I retreated it with tempo to d2. But this was rather useful, because after 14 queen to c5, 15 queen to a4, Black was having some embarrassing problems due to losing further time with his queen on the c file. He continued 15 bishop to e7, 16 rook from a to c1, queen to b6. Now white won material by force with the move 17 bishop to a5, queen takes on b2, 18 bishop to b5, threatening rook takes c8 check. And so black castled and white played bishop takes d7. There was a clear piece up. So to return once again to diagram 8, the move 13 bishop e7, again simply continuing development white played in the game Nunn Cisniega from Mexico in 1977, played 14 rook a to c1, black castle, Nunn played 15 bishop to e3, black played queen to d8, and Nunn now played the rather transparent move 16 queen to d2, clearly intending a sacrifice on h6. But after f6 from black at move 16, he developed serious counterplay down the f file. So a suggested improvement is the continuing positional style with a move 16 queen to e2. In order to unravel his pieces, black is forced to play either f6 or f5 here. And either way, white can then take on f6. Black recaptures with a knight, and then 18 bishop to d4. When white has a pawn down, there's a tremendous gambit and possibilities of attacking the black king's line. In particular, the weakened square g6 beckons to a white knight through knight e5 to g6. And we'll be seeing something very similar to this in our analysis of black's alternative move, at move 12, and that is queen to c5. So we'll go back to diagram 8 now. Please retract the black move 8-6 on white's reply, bishop to f4, and substitute instead the move 12 queen to c5. Now this move allows the move 13 bishop takes h7. Now black has allowed white to regain material equality, but by then taking on c2, black has a perfectly good position, since white's chances of initiative have vanished with the queens off the board. So this can be seen as a totally satisfactory equalizing weapon for black. So after queen c5, a superior try to try and gain the initiative is the move 13 queen e2, since white hopes to profit from that position of the black queen at c5 by gaining further time attacking it, as I did in a similar situation against Ravi Kumar. While 13 bishop e7 is a natural continuation. Now the move 14 bishop e3 looks natural, but the move 14 bishop d2 may well be superior. White then castles at move 14, and white makes use of one of his main features of this gambit. That's the c file, the fact he occupies the c file with tempo in many variations. 15 rook a to c1. The black queen is attacked and goes to b6. And now, in a couple of games with John Nunn, which illustrate his very straightforward, very powerful attacking style, he played the move 16 bishop to b1. I'm sure the idea behind this move is obvious to everybody. So to stop that queen and bishop battery on the h7 b1 diagonal, black played f5 now. Well, this must be taken to be consistent, so white played e takes f6 en passant. And black took with a knight. He might well consider taking with a bishop here. None suggests the possibility h4 at move 18 after 17 bishop takes f6. And then bishop takes b2, leaving off his analysis there. You might well consider looking at this position for yourself after bishop takes f6. There are other possibilities for white. Queen d3, rook f to e1, perhaps a very simple b3. answering e5 with queen d3, picking up the d pawn. Plenty of scope for analysis there. So after 16 f5, 17 e takes f6 en passant, knight takes f6, bishop to c3, bishop to d7, 19 rook f to e1. We have a position similar to the one I suggested in the analysis of that Cisniega game. The white is a pawn down, but has tremendous compensation, these two bishops bearing down on the black king. The e file, strong squares at e5. Black hasn't weakened his king side with the move h6 as he had in the corresponding position, so he might have slightly superior defensive chances here. We're going to look at the game Nunn versus Bell now. You'll find the game Nunn-Mednis on the enclosed booklet. And in this game, Nunn-Bell from Basingstoke, the player of the black pieces played 19 rook a to c8, a very natural move to contest the position. And then followed up with 20 bishop to d4. Had the black queen retreated to d8 now, he might well have taken that a7 pawn off to have some positional compensation, or to equal the position materially, but leave white with a superior position. So after queen a5 at move 20, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, white played the very natural, the very strong move, 22 knight g5, with these two threats of taking on e6 and taking on f6, followed by taking on e6. Well, in view of this, white must at least regain material equality and stand better. But his opponent allowed a spectacular finish with the move bishop to b4. It's Nunn then sacrificed with the move 23, bishop takes f6. Had black now played bishop takes e1, the continuation 24, bishop takes h7 check, king to f8, 25, bishop takes g7 check. If you see, you can't take that bishop. King to e7, 26, queen to e5 would have followed, with checkmate imminent. Very fine continuation. So we return to diagram 9, after 19, rook f to e1. The game Nunn-Mednis. Just have a few look at this for a few moves. He played 19, bishop to b4. Nunn quite naturally avoided the exchange of one of his best pieces, the 20, bishop to d4. And Mednis played in response queen to a5. Now this move was probably over-ambitious, and by retreating queen to d8 and keeping the queen in that sector of the board, he would considerably reduce Nunn's attacking possibilities. And after queen a5, Nunn of course moved his attack rook with rook e to d1. I think we're going to leave off the analysis of this game here. You'll find a continuation in the booklet, and it's very easy to understand White's strategy. The long-term pressure and bind he gets for this pawn, characteristic of this pawn sacrifice. The whole line with knight gf3 is not entirely clear. We think it's a very enterprising, much more interesting move than the normal lines with knight e2. Due to a very slight positional advantage at best for white. We'll now examine the possibilities for black as move 7, instead of playing queen d6 and chasing the pawn. Some rather less sharp ideas. And the first one we look at is when black plays 7, c takes on d4, 8, c takes on d4, and white plays, and then black plays f6. Now, from the analysis of the green large variation, you'll note that the move knight g5 is possible here. But I'm not going to recommend that, because it's slightly a different position. And I think that after 8 f6 in that position, white should continue quite simply with e takes on f6. If black plays queen takes f6, then white should castle, I think. And in that position, black can grab the queen's pawn again, but if he plays 10, knight takes d4, white plays knight takes d4, queen takes d4, knight to f3, that moves his queen to f6 perhaps, and then bishop g5, queen to f7, queen c2, and I think you'll see that white has very similar compensation to the pawns in the main lines, but black is even further behind in development. So if you stop and play back to the position after 10 castles, black plays bishop d6 instead of knight takes d4. Then by continuing with knight to b3, the black will probably castle. Now white can implement a very strong manoeuvre of exchanging off the dark-squared bishops. And in view of the fact that black's pawn structure is on light squares in the centre, this will give him a positional advantage. He can play 12 bishop g5. Of course, queen f7 is the only move then. And then bishop to h4, a very characteristic manoeuvre in the Tarrasch variation with 3 knight f6. And then whatever black does on his next move, since black can't advance in the centre really without leaving himself with a big weakness, white can just play bishop to g3 and either gain control of a very important diagonal or exchange off those important dark squared bishops with a positional advantage. If you now return to diagram 7, we'll examine another possibility of defence for black, and that's to play 7 c takes on d4, 8 c takes on d4, 8 knight to b6. And this is similar to the Leningrad variation of the French defence, which would occur if white had played the move 7 knight e2, and black would play the same move, c takes d4, c takes d4, knight b6. Now clearly with his knight in front of the f-pawn, white can't consider advancing f4, f5. But he will get some compensation for that in terms of very active piece play on the king side. Now there have been several Grandmaster games in this line where both sides finessed with the moves a3, a5 and b3. And a great deal of subtle play went on to avoid the creation of weaknesses on the queen side for both sides. I'm going to recommend a rather more direct continuation. I've had this position against Andrew Whiteley at the tournament in Portsmouth. I played 9 castles here. And white may indeed follow up with a3 and b4 to gain an advantage on both sides of the board. So to preempt that, Whiteley played the move knight b4. I played bishop to b1. Very characteristic move to keep the bishop on that important diagonal. Bishop d7 for black. Now I played rook to e1, a move which is prophylactic in a sense, since it further discourages black from playing f6. Not that he was likely to, but also importantly vacates the square f1, so the knight can come round to g3 and to h5. And white played the move bishop a4, which is a slight finesse, since he wants to play bishop b3. He plays bishop a4. I beg your pardon, wants to play bishop to b5 as black. But he tries to provoke the move b3 first on the queen side, so as later to profit from that by advancing his a-pawn. So he played bishop to a4. I played 10b3, 11b3 rather. He played his bishop to b5. Now I played knight f1, bringing this knight round to the important squares on the king side. And clearly, since black has put most of his minor pieces on the queen side, there must be a corresponding difficulty in defending the king side. And now he played the move a5, consistent with his philosophy of weakening the queen side for white. But now I was able to play a very strong move here. I played knight g5. It was a simple threat of taking on h7 or following up with queen h5. So black was forced to play the highly undesirable move g6. And now again, played a very easily understandable move, queen f3. And in order to stop queen f6 or queen takes f7, black was forced to play queen e7. And now white got a very big advantage with the move knight e3. Since the idea is to bring this knight to g4 and to f6. And in order to stop that, black played h6. Now the important point is he can't play queen takes d5, g5 rather, because of the reply knight takes d5. And if queen back to d8, white can simply play knight to f6 check, king to e7, bishop to g5 with unstoppable threats. And so after my move knight to e3, white if at h6, played my knight to h3, now he castled queenside. But after the reply by me, knight f4, it was extremely hard for black to find anything sensible to do. His kingside is frozen to an extent, and moves such as f6 and g5 are totally ruled out through his dominating white knights. I think we'll leave off the analysis of this pseudo-Leningrad variation there. In the enclosed booklet you'll find a brilliant game, Benjamin versus Seirawan, which won the Brilliancy Prize at the US Junior Championship 1979 in this variation. I think with that we'll conclude our analysis of this still not totally clear pawn sacrifice. I think it's a very enterprising idea for white. It certainly leads to some very interesting possibilities. In the final part of the tape, we'll look at the other main reply to the Tarrasch variation, that is 3c5. This was used time and time again by Korchnoi in his two matches with Karpov. It would be a brave man who said he wouldn't use this variation again in their World Championship match this year. After 3c5, white universally plays e takes d5, and black will almost always recapture with the e-pawn here. To take with the queen on d5 is not totally out of the question. Play may then continue knight g to f3, pawn takes pawn, bishop c4, queen d6, castles. Since black can't keep the pawn with e5 because of the reply knight takes e5, followed by rook e1, white will eventually regain the pawn with a small advantage. So after e takes d5, the move knight gf3 is certainly playable. But in recent years, the move 5 bishop b5 check has attracted attention. And the reply knight d7 here will lead to a slight congestion in the black position, so the only two moves that have been played are knight c6 and bishop d7. After knight c6, queen to e2 check, bishop to e7, d takes on c5, knight to f6, knight to b3. We have a characteristic middle game of the Tarrasch variation looming up. It's very likely black will regain that pawn on c5, but nevertheless he'll be left with this isolated queen's pawn in the middle game. The move bishop d7 in reply to bishop b5 check is usually met by the move queen e2 check. Now, of course, black can exchange queens here with queen e7 if he wishes to. But white shouldn't be worried about any endgame that arises here, because once again there is this isolated queen's pawn as a feature of the position which will likely to give him a small advantage. Indeed, in the World Championship match of 1978, in game 16, Korchnoi did interpolate the queen for move 6, and play continued. 7, bishop takes d7 check, knight takes d7, pawn takes on c5, knight takes on c5, knight to b3, queen takes on e2 check, knight takes on e2, knight takes on b3, a takes on b3. And that position may seem slightly simplified to you, but there's a tangible and clear advantage for white in that isolated queen's pawn, something to play against. In fact, in this endgame, middle game situation, Karpov was able to conjure up considerable pressure, and Korchnoi had some difficulty in holding the draw. So if you'd like to refer back to diagram 10, after queen e2 check, the other interpolation, bishop e7, was also played by Karpov, by Korchnoi rather, in that match. I'd like to centre our discussion of this move around the game Tal Portiche, for tournament in Montreal, 1979. White played, of course, 7 d takes on c5, and black played knight f6. Again, he's counting on recovering that pawn later on. White played 8, knight to b3, black castle. White played 9, bishop e3. clearly intending to make it as difficult as possible for black to recover that pawn. And now 9 rook to e8 from black. White played 10 knight to f3. And black could now have played bishop takes on c5, because of course bishop takes on c5 for white in response is impossible, he loses the queen. So he must play knight takes c5, queen a5 check, queen to d2, queen takes on b5. But then castles queenside for white would still leave him with a slight advantage in that middle game situation, once again because of that isolated queen's pawn. In the game Tal Portish chose another move, e6. And were white to exchange on d7 now, of course black would soon recapture that c-pawn. So he chose to move bishop d3. Again, he can't keep the c-pawn, but he wants to get a small advantage in this middle game situation. And after 11, bishop to a4, funny looking move, but it vacates the d7 square and tries to take off a defender of that c-pawn. White could consider castling queenside here. In fact, played the move 11, knight from f3 to d4. So that if bishop takes b3, he has knight takes b3. He still holds onto that pawn on c5 for another move. And black played 12, knight from b8 to d7. And now white castled queenside. Castling kingside was certainly possible there, but Tal has an interesting continuation in mind. Black played 13, knight takes on c5, and white played 14, knight f5, very important and pleasant square for that knight in this variation. And Portish, unwilling to see the demise of his important king bishop, played 13, bishop to f8. 14, bishop to f8, pardon. And Tal played 15, knight takes on c5, and Portish recaptured, again exploiting this pin on the e-file for the moment. And Tal broke it with a move 16, queen f3, breaking this pin. And so the bishop is now on prise, and Portish played bishop takes e3 check, knight takes e3. I think hereabouts we can leave our discussion of this variation, this game. The rest of the game you'll find in the booklet. The way that Tal built up pressure on this isolated queen's pawn, and in trying to defend it ingeniously, Portish got a rook strung up on the queen side in a web of Tal's pawns. Tal getting the slight advantage of the exchange for a pawn, realizing it with fine technique. But the feature of this move 5, bishop to b5 check, which distinguishes it from the move 4, knight g to f5, knight gf to f3 rather, is likely to lead to exchange of more pairs of pieces. As I said, it's a dangerous generalization, but on the whole, in view of this isolated queen's pawn, black is worried about endgames. Many times in these last two matches between Karpov and Korchnoi, 74 and 78, we saw these endgames occurring. With this isolated queen's pawn for black, it's really a headache to defend these positions. I don't think Korchnoi lost a single game with the French defence in both of those matches, but he was certainly on the ropes in some of them. Certainly should have lost one or two. Let's look at the move. Let's go back to a move we already mentioned, the move 5, knight to c6 now, because clearly if I'm talking about black exchanging pieces and getting to an inferior endgame, this move does avoid the exchange of a pair of bishops at least. So we'll now look at a game, I mentioned it briefly, we'll now look at slightly more depth of the game with that move 5, knight to c6. This is the game Karpov-Unziger from Munich, 1979. After bishop b5 check, Unziger did indeed play this interpolation knight c6, and Karpov chose a very simple move, 6 knight to e2. Unziger played bishop d6 then. And really whatever move he'd chosen on his sixth move, a similar type of position would have arisen. And Karpov took the opportunity to isolate the black queen pawn with tempo by playing d takes c5, forcing the black bishop to move again with bishop takes c5. And then white castled. Black played knight to e7. White played 9, knight to b3. Unziger retreated the bishop to b6, trying to retain activity. Had he played it to d6, Karpov could simply have played 10 bishop to f4, for example. Because as we said before, so often in these isolated queen's pawn positions, exchanges only increase white's advantage. But after the move bishop b6, Karpov played 10, bishop f4. Unziger castled. Karpov played 11, queen to d2, building up on this isolated queen's pawn. And black played 11, bishop g4, and Karpov simply played h3, bishop takes on e2, bishop takes on e2 for white. And we think we can stop our analysis of the opening here and just say that white has the two bishops and black has an isolated queen's pawn. This is a clear advantage to white. And in general, the positions after 3 c5, whereas after the move 3 knight f6, I gave a lot of variations to be memorized, tricky ones to be memorized, and they must be memorized due to the complexity of the positions. In general, the positions arising from 3 c5 are to be understood rather than remembered, because in general the whole opening confers a very small advantage to white in view of this isolated queen's pawn. And the variations we've given in this game bear that out, I think. You'll find one or two games on the enclosed booklet also to support that conclusion. Well, with that we conclude our survey of the Tarrasch defense. I think from the cassette you get some useful ideas about just about every conceivable reply for black. The only variation where we go into really detailed analysis, I think, are those, the Greenmile variation, where I've suggested this move 6 bishop d3, and the pawn sacrifice, heavily analysed by John Nunn, with one or two suggestions by me, with 7 knight gf3 against the move 3 knight f6. In conclusion, let's just say the move 3 c5, which you may encounter many times in practice, is easily and simply met by this takes on d5, 4 bishop b5 check, simplifying line. And one must expect to get just a small advantage from that. I hope you find the cassette useful, and thank you very much.